Long before towers pierced the skyline or limestone walls declared status and lineage, the land beneath Highclere Castle already carried weight. This was not empty countryside waiting for grandeur. It was worked, watched, and fought over centuries before the first stone was ever laid. Archaeological evidence places human activity here as early as the Iron Age, with earthworks and burial traces indicating that this ridge of chalkland was valued for visibility, defensibility, and ritual significance. The hill rises subtly above the surrounding Hampshire landscape, not dramatic but commanding, high enough to see, high enough to be seen. In early Britain that mattered. Height meant power, and power always attracts conflict. Stand on the grounds as they existed more than 1,000 years ago. No facade. No symmetry. Just wind across open fields, dense woodland at the margins, and a sky that felt closer than it does now. This land sat near ancient routeways connecting Wessex settlements, making it a strategic waypoint rather than an isolated refuge. Long before Norman surveys and estate maps, it functioned as a node, social, spiritual, and military. Pagan Britain left few written records, but the ground itself speaks. Burial mounds once dotted nearby slopes, their placement deliberate, aligned with seasonal light and elevated sightlines. These were not graves meant to be hidden. They were declarations. This land belonged to someone. This land was watched by ancestors. Ritual and authority were inseparable here. Pagan worship in early Anglo-Saxon England was deeply tied to landscape, groves, high places, springs. The hill that would one day support Highclere Castle fits that pattern precisely. Before Christianity imposed churches and fixed doctrine, power was mediated through visible control of sacred space. To gather people on a rise like this was to command both belief and obedience. The land did not just produce crops. It produced legitimacy. That is the first unseen cost behind the facade. Centuries of spiritual authority built into the soil itself. By the 7th and 8th centuries, as Saxon kingdoms hardened into political entities, this territory fell under the shifting influence of Wessex. Control was rarely stable. Charters changed hands. Allegiances shifted. Land grants were issued, revoked, reissued. Ownership was less about permanence and more about survival. To hold land like this was to sit at the intersection of loyalty and threat. When kings rewarded followers, they did so with estates that could sustain armed households. This hill offered both food and oversight. It was valuable precisely because it could support power without a crown. Step past the modern gardens and imagine the earlier structures. Timber halls, storage pits, animal enclosures. Not elegant but efficient. These early complexes functioned as machines. Grain in. Rent collected. Men housed. Authority enforced. The architecture was temporary but the system was not. Landholding here already depended on extraction, labor, harvests, obligations. Peasant families worked the fields below, bound by customs they did not write. The machinery of luxury had not yet acquired marble or chandeliers, but it was already operating. Someone benefited. Someone paid. Burial evidence suggests continuity across generations, reinforcing the idea that this was not transient ground. People returned to bury their dead where power had once lived. That matters. In early medieval England, burial location was a political act. To be laid to rest on contested or elevated land was to stake a claim beyond death. It said, "Our lineage endures here. Our memory cannot be erased easily." Highclere's land was already carrying that burden of inherited authority long before the word estate applied. The Norman conquest did not introduce power to this hill. It formalized it. When William's forces swept through England in 1066, they did not create dominance from nothing. They identified sites already wired for control and reprogrammed them. By the time the Doomsday Book was compiled in 1086, this land was recorded, assessed, and taxed. Its value was quantified. What had once been ritual ground became economic asset. What had once been defended by custom was now defended by law and force. The bill came due in coin and compliance. But even then, stone had not yet claimed the skyline. The early Norman presence relied on timber fortifications, practical and intimidating but temporary by design. The choice of this location for later monumental building was not aesthetic. It was logistical. It had always been about leverage, over roads, over people, over memory. Architecture would simply make that leverage permanent. Behind every later facade, this older story persists. The manicured lawns cover burial earth. The gravel paths trace ancient routes of movement and control. The house that would rise here did not invent its authority. It inherited it, layer by layer, from pagan ritual to Saxon power to Norman administration. Each system replaced the last, but none erased it completely. They built on top of it, literally and morally. This is what they do not show in postcards and period dramas. Before beauty there was belief. Before belief there was fear. Before fear, there was land that could see farther than the people who fought over it. Highclere Castle did not begin as a home. It began as a claim. And claims, once made, rarely fade quietly. If this ground could speak, it would not whisper. It would remind you that every great house stands on older debts, and the cost of keeping it alive always starts long before the walls. When the church arrived on this hill, it did not come quietly. By the early medieval period, the land that would become Highclere Castle had shifted from pagan authority to ecclesiastical control, and with that shift came a new kind of power, one that spoke of salvation while operating with the discipline of a state. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the bishops of Winchester had secured control of the estate, not as spiritual retreat, but as infrastructure. This was a fortified palace in function if not yet in stone, designed to project authority across Hampshire while sitting just close enough to royal routes to matter. The church here was not praying in isolation. It was governing. Stand on the ridge as it existed then. Timber halls replaced ritual clearings. Defensive earthworks were maintained, not against foreign invasion, but against political instability. The bishop was not simply a clergyman. He was one of the most powerful administrators in England. Winchester itself was a financial engine, and its bishops controlled vast estates, collected rents, enforced law, and advised kings. Highclere functioned as a forward position, a place to host officials, store produce, and demonstrate control over land that generated income. The architecture followed the logic of power. Thick boundaries, clear sight lines. Buildings arranged for oversight rather than comfort. Behind the religious language was a transactional reality. The church held land because the crown needed it to. Kings granted estates to bishops in exchange for loyalty, legitimacy, and administrative reach. This was power without a crown, exercised through charters, seals, and sermons. When disputes arose between monarch and nobility, the church often stood in the middle, brokering outcomes that benefited itself. Highclere's role in this system was subtle but essential. It was a node in a network of ecclesiastical estates that allowed Winchester's bishops to move, monitor, and manage their holdings efficiently. Horses needed stabling. Grain needed storage. Records needed protection. All of that required built form. Step past the romantic image of a country house and picture instead a working compound. Storehouses filled with tithes extracted from surrounding villages. Accommodation for clerks and armed retainers. Kitchens scaled not for family dining but for hosting entourages. The bishop traveled with dozens of people, scribes, guards, servants, messengers. This was the machinery of luxury in its early form, fueled by obligation rather than wages. The unseen hands were everywhere. Peasants labored to support an institution that claimed moral authority while living off compulsory contribution. The bill came due every harvest. The uneasy relationship between church and crown shaped every decision here. When royal power strengthened, bishops aligned themselves visibly with the king. When it weakened, they fortified their positions. Highclere's early defenses reflect that tension. It was not a castle in the later sense, but it was no open manor. Boundaries mattered. Control mattered. The threat was not rebellion alone, but confiscation. A bishop who fell out of favor could lose land overnight. Architecture became insurance. A well-organized estate was harder to dismantle. A strategically placed residence was harder to ignore. Corruption was not an aberration, it was systemic. Records from the period show bishops engaging in land swaps, legal manipulations, and quiet agreements that enriched their office while maintaining an appearance of piety. Estates like Highclere were central to that strategy. They were used to reward allies, host negotiations, and signal stability. To stand here as a visiting noble or royal agent was to understand that the church was not subordinate. It was a parallel authority, embedded in stone, timber, and agricultural output. By the time of the Norman conquest, this system was already mature. William's regime did not dismantle ecclesiastical power, it relied on it. Bishops became some of the largest landholders in Norman England, and Highclere remained under their control, now folded into a more formalized feudal structure. Obligations were codified. Values were assessed. The estate's productivity was measured and taxed. What had once been spiritual stewardship became bureaucratic management. The architecture adapted accordingly. Administrative spaces expanded. Storage capacity increased. The house became a machine. Stand in the imagined great hall of this period. Not lavish but imposing. Long tables for accounting as much as feasting. Walls that heard legal disputes, not just prayers. This was where rents were calculated, where grievances were addressed, where loyalty was tested. The bishop's authority flowed outward from places like this, enforced not only by doctrine but by control of resources. To defy the church here was to risk economic ruin. Land access could be denied. Protection could be withdrawn. Salvation was abstract. Survival was not. What they don't show in later portrayals is how deeply this site was shaped by compromise and calculation. The church presented itself as eternal, but it was constantly negotiating its position. Highclere's early form reflects that instability. It was built to adapt, to be repurposed, to survive regime change. That flexibility would later allow it to transition from ecclesiastical estate to aristocratic seat. The groundwork, literal and institutional, was already in place. When control of the land passed into aristocratic hands, the transformation was neither gentle nor accidental. What emerged at Highclere was a deliberate reinvention, driven by the Herbert family's need to convert inherited territory into visible, unquestioned authority. By the late Tudor and early Stuart periods, England's power no longer rested solely on church or crown. It rested on families who could finance loyalty, administer estates, and project permanence. Highclere became one of those projections. The house that began to take shape here was not simply a residence. It was a statement written into the landscape. The Herberts understood that land alone was no longer enough. Power now required display. Their earliest rebuilding efforts focused on scale and control rather than ornament. The estate expanded outward, absorbing surrounding fields, consolidating tenant farms, and reorganizing access roads so that movement across the land flowed toward the house. This was architecture as management. Boundaries were clarified. Sightlines were engineered. To approach Highclere was to understand who owned the horizon. Behind the facade, the machinery of luxury was already operating. Surveyors measuring acreage, stewards calculating yields, tenants paying rent that funded further expansion. Stand at the edge of the grounds as they were reshaped in the 16th and 17th centuries. You would not see symmetry yet, but you would feel intention. The house rose where it could dominate approach routes, its elevation reinforced by cleared sight lines and disciplined landscaping. Trees were felled not for beauty but for visibility. Fields were reorganized to maximize income and reduce resistance. This was a house designed to be unavoidable. If you lived nearby, you worked for it, paid it, or answered to it. The Herbert family's rise was tightly bound to service to the crown, and Highclere became proof of that relationship. Offices held at court translated into funds, favors, and protection. Those advantages were reinvested here. Each architectural upgrade reflected a political calculation. A larger hall for hosting officials. Improved accommodations for guests who mattered. Storage facilities capable of supporting large gatherings during hunting seasons or political visits. The estate had to function flawlessly because reputation depended on logistics. Failure was visible. Success was contagious. By the 18th century, Highclere's identity as a grand country estate was fully formed. The house had become a machine, one that converted agricultural output into social capital. Wheat, livestock, timber, and rents flowed inward. Hospitality, influence, and allegiance flowed outward. Maintaining that balance required staff. Dozens of workers operated behind the scenes. Bailiffs managing farms, clerks keeping accounts, gardeners reshaping the grounds to signal refinement. None of this was decorative. Every role existed to reinforce dominance. The unseen hands were essential, even if they were never acknowledged. Step past the public rooms as they existed then and imagine the service corridors, the storage rooms, the administrative spaces where decisions were made quietly. This is where the cost of keeping it alive accumulated. Roofs needed constant repair. Roads required maintenance. Tenant disputes demanded resolution. The estate's survival depended on discipline. Debts were tracked carefully. Income shortfalls triggered immediate changes. Higher rents, stricter leases, land sales at the margins. Beauty was expensive, but inefficiency was fatal. Highclere's growing grandeur also served a defensive purpose. In a period marked by political instability, rebellion, and shifting alliances, an imposing estate signaled security. It suggested continuity. To invest heavily in architecture was to declare confidence in one's future. The Herbert family used stone, layout, and scale to project inevitability. This house would outlast rivals. This land would remain theirs. The message was subtle but effective. Power without a crown still needed symbols, and Highclere supplied them. The estate's influence extended beyond its boundaries. Local economies became dependent on its operation. Employment, trade, and seasonal work tied surrounding communities to the house's fortunes. When the estate prospered, so did the region, unevenly. When it tightened its grip, hardship followed. This dependency was not incidental. It reinforced loyalty and reduced resistance. Who really paid for this transformation was never in doubt. The wealth that funded Highclere's rebirth was extracted incrementally year after year from those with little choice. Behind the facade of refinement lay constant pressure. Aristocratic power demanded upkeep, and the bill always came due. Harvest failures, market fluctuations, or political missteps could threaten the entire structure. The Herbert family responded by doubling down on visibility. More improvement. More consolidation. More emphasis on Highclere as the center of gravity. The house absorbed risk so that the family status could appear stable, even when finances strained. Stand on the grounds at the height of this transformation and listen. You would hear activity everywhere, Carts moving, workers calling, livestock managed at scale. This was not a quiet retreat. It was a working capital hub. The architecture reflected that purpose. Grandeur framed utility. Comfort masked calculation. What they don't show is how relentlessly practical the design choices were. Every wing, every courtyard, every approach served a function tied to control. By the mid-19th century, the old house at Highclere no longer satisfied the demands placed upon it. What had once been sufficient as an aristocratic seat now felt dated, cautious, even vulnerable. Britain was changing rapidly. Industrial wealth was rewriting social hierarchies, and status had to be asserted more loudly than ever. For the Herbert family, quiet authority was no longer enough. Visibility mattered. Grandeur mattered. And so the decision was made to rebuild almost entirely, not to preserve but to transform. The reconstruction began in earnest in the 1840s, driven by the 3rd Earl of Carnarvon, who wanted Highclere to speak the architectural language of power. He turned to Charles Barry, one of the most celebrated architects of the age, fresh from his work on the Houses of Parliament. The choice was deliberate. Barry's Gothic Revival style carried weight, medieval in appearance, modern in ambition. It suggested lineage, continuity, and moral seriousness, even when newly constructed. Behind the facade, however, the story was far less stable. Stand on the estate as construction unfolds. Hundreds of laborers arrive. Stone is quarried and hauled. Timber is cut, shaped, and lifted into place. This is not a cosmetic renovation. Entire wings are replaced. Towers are raised. Roof lines are reimagined to dominate the skyline. The house grows taller, heavier, more theatrical. But the ground beneath it has not changed. Foundations originally designed for earlier structures are forced to bear new loads. Compromises are made. Reinforcements are added selectively, not comprehensively. Time and money dictate engineering decisions more than prudence. The Gothic Revival exterior projects permanence, but much of the structure beneath is practical rather than ideal. Brick replaces stone in areas never meant to be seen. Timber framing is stretched to its limits. Ventilation and drainage systems are retrofitted rather than redesigned, creating vulnerabilities that will surface later. What they don't show is how often speed trumped durability. Prestige had a deadline. Social seasons could not wait. Inside, the transformation is equally calculated. Rooms are enlarged to host gatherings that signal relevance at the highest levels of society. Ceilings rise. Staircases become statements. Corridors are extended to separate public spectacle from private logistics. The machinery of luxury becomes more complex. Servants' routes multiply. Kitchens are expanded to support dinners for dozens. Storage rooms are built to hold tableware, textiles, fuel. Each improvement increases operational costs. Each improvement requires labor to sustain it. Step past the showpiece rooms and into the hidden corridors. Here the Victorian house reveals its true nature, not as a home but as an engine. Bell systems connect rooms to servants below. Coal must be delivered constantly to heat the expanded interior. Water systems strain to meet demand. Maintenance becomes a daily battle. Cracks appear. Damp settles in unseen corners. The cost of keeping it alive escalates year after year. And the bill comes due quickly. The rebuilding of Highclere is financed largely through borrowing, drawing on estate income and accumulated wealth that proves insufficient for the scale of ambition. Estimates vary, but costs run into hundreds of thousands of pounds, a staggering sum in Victorian Britain. Debt becomes a permanent companion. Interest payments compete with upkeep. Estate revenues are redirected from long-term stability to short-term appearance. Fields that once buffered financial shocks are now committed to servicing loans. The pursuit of social prestige drives decisions that leave little margin for error. Highclere must compete with newly built mansions funded by industrial fortunes, houses unburdened by centuries of maintenance. To remain relevant, the estate leans harder into display. Events grow larger. Guest lists become more exclusive. The house must perform. Failure is not an option, because irrelevance is a kind of death in aristocratic society. Behind the facade, staff numbers swell. Housemaids, footmen, cooks, gardeners, grooms, all required to maintain the illusion. Wages, uniforms, food, housing. None of it is optional. The unseen hands multiply, and with them the dependency of surrounding communities deepens. Employment binds people to the estate's survival. When finances tighten, pressure rolls downhill. Rents rise. Contracts harden. Generosity narrows. Who really paid for this reinvention is not difficult to answer. The architectural choices themselves reveal the tension. Gothic revival suggests ancient legitimacy, yet everything is new. Towers imply defense, yet serve no military function. The house performs history while relying on modern credit. It is power without a crown, expressed through pointed arches and dramatic silhouettes. A legacy built on borrowed time. Stand beneath the great towers and look upward. The structure commands awe, but it also hides anxiety. Every addition increases weight on foundations never meant for such scale. Every decorative flourish increases surfaces that must be cleaned, repaired, replaced. Victorian optimism masks fragility. The house appears eternal. Its finances are not. What makes this reinvention particularly dangerous is its success. Highclere becomes admired, photographed, discussed. The prestige it generates reinforces the belief that the investment was necessary. Doubts are suppressed. Maintenance is deferred where possible. Structural compromises are tolerated. The appearance of solidity becomes more important than actual resilience. This is the dark paradox of the Victorian rebuild. In chasing permanence, the house becomes more vulnerable. In projecting wealth, it exhausts it. The Gothic facade promises continuity, but the balance sheets tell a different story. The machinery of luxury is running hotter, faster, with less room to recover from disruption. Beneath the grandeur of Highclere Castle existed a parallel world, carefully concealed and rigorously controlled. While guests moved through gilded rooms and sweeping staircases, an entirely different architecture governed the lives of those who made that elegance possible. This was not incidental. It was designed. The servant hierarchy at Highclere was built into the structure itself, a system of corridors, stairwells, and rules that ensured labor remained invisible and obedience absolute. Stand in the main hall and look around. The silence feels effortless. But that silence was produced. Below your feet, behind the walls, and beyond locked doors, dozens of people moved continuously to maintain the illusion. At its peak in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Highclere required a staff numbering between 40 and 60, depending on the season. Each had a defined role, a fixed place in the hierarchy, and little room to deviate. The house did not function without them. Yet it was built to pretend they were not there. The servant structure mirrored a military chain of command. At the top stood the butler and housekeeper, powerful figures who controlled access, discipline, and daily operations. Beneath them were footmen, maids, valets, cooks, scullery workers, laundresses, and hall boys, often teenagers sent from rural families to earn wages that barely covered survival. Hours were long. A 16-hour day was common. Time off was rare. Privacy was almost non-existent. This was the cost of keeping it alive. Step past the showpiece rooms and descend into the service areas. Ceilings drop. Light fades. Air thickens with heat and coal dust. Servants' staircases are narrow by design, forcing bodies to move single file. Corridors bend deliberately, preventing accidental encounters with guests. Bells line the walls, each connected to a specific room above. When one rings, someone must run. Delay is noticed. Discipline is enforced quietly but firmly. Sleeping quarters reflect rank. Senior staff may have small private rooms. Junior staff share cramped dormitories, often unheated, with thin walls and shared wash facilities. Personal possessions are minimal. Storage is limited. Everything about the space communicates impermanence. You are here to work, not to settle. Behind the facade, the house demands total availability. Meals are taken separately, quickly, and according to strict protocol. Servants eat food prepared from leftovers or cheaper cuts, timed so that service above is never interrupted. Conversation is monitored. Complaints are discouraged. Mistakes are recorded. A broken plate, a missed bell, a visible presence at the wrong moment, all carry consequences. Wages can be docked. References can be withheld. In a society where employment options are narrow, that threat is enough. What they don't show is how deeply this system shaped lives. Many servants arrived in their early teens and left physically worn before middle age. Domestic service offered stability but little advancement. Loyalty was expected, not rewarded. The house benefited from continuity, but individuals were replaceable. If someone fell ill, another took their place. The machinery of luxury could not pause. Women bore much of the burden. Housemaids scrubbed floors, cleaned fireplaces, and carried water before plumbing was fully modernized. Laundry was a relentless task, boiling, beating, drying heavy fabrics by hand. Injuries were common. Exhaustion was constant. Yet silence was mandatory. The elegance above depended on suffering below remaining unseen. Men too were constrained. Footmen trained to move without sound, to stand for hours without shifting, to present a polished image that reflected the family's status. Appearance mattered more than comfort. Livery had to be maintained at personal cost. Boots polished. Gloves clean. Any lapse was interpreted as disrespect. Stand still in one of the hidden corridors and listen. You would hear footsteps, whispered instructions, the dull thud of coal being moved, the hiss of boilers struggling to heat an expanding house. These systems were unforgiving. Breakdowns increased pressure on staff, who compensated with longer hours and improvised repairs. Modern conveniences, when introduced, rarely reduced labor. They increased expectations. The hierarchy also enforced emotional distance. Servants were discouraged from forming visible relationships with the family. Familiarity was dangerous. Too much presence risked dismissal. Too little efficiency risked the same. The balance was exhausting. To serve at Highclere was to live constantly on display while remaining unseen. Economic dependence tightened the grip. Local villages relied on the estate for employment. Generations passed through the same service roles, creating a cycle that was difficult to escape. When the house prospered, work was plentiful. When finances tightened, staff numbers were reduced first. Loyalty did not guarantee security. The bill always came due and it was paid downward. Behind the facade of aristocratic calm lay constant tension. Servants knew the rhythms of the house better than anyone. They sensed financial strain before it was acknowledged publicly. Menus changed, repairs delayed, positions left unfilled. The house that appeared timeless was always negotiating survival, and those negotiations were felt most sharply below stairs. This hidden world was essential to Highclere's operation. Without it, the house would collapse into chaos within days. Yet recognition was minimal. Names rarely recorded. Stories seldom preserved. The architecture ensured that history focused upward, toward owners and guests, while erasing the labor that sustained them. Stand at the edge of the servants' domain and look back toward the grand rooms. The distance is not just physical. It is moral. Beauty was maintained through control. Comfort was built on constraint. The elegance admired by the upper class was paid for in time, health, and silence. When war reached Highclere Castle, it did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived with orders, requisition forms, and the quiet understanding that the house would no longer belong to itself. In 1914, as Europe slid into industrialized conflict, estates like Highclere were absorbed into the national emergency. Grandeur became capacity. Prestige became utility. The house that once staged dinners and negotiations was repurposed to receive the broken bodies of men returned from the front. Stand in the great rooms as they were stripped of furniture. Rugs rolled away. Paintings removed or covered. Beds replaced chairs. The transformation was rapid and largely irreversible. Highclere became a convalescent hospital for wounded officers, chosen not for sentiment but for logistics. It had space. It had water. It had kitchens capable of mass preparation. It had staff already trained to operate under hierarchy. The machinery of luxury was redirected toward survival. Dozens of soldiers arrived at a time, many bearing injuries that were poorly understood and inadequately treated. Shrapnel wounds, gas damage, amputations, infections that spread quickly despite the best efforts of medical staff. The grand halls echoed not with conversation but with coughing, groans, and the measured footsteps of nurses working double shifts. Medical infrastructure was improvised. Rooms never designed for sanitation struggled under the demands of sterilization, ventilation, and isolation. Step past the former drawing rooms and imagine rows of iron beds under high ceilings meant for chandeliers. Those ceilings trapped heat in summer and cold in winter. Heating systems designed for comfort proved inadequate for medical need. Drafts moved freely through the building. Windows were opened for air circulation, even in poor weather. The architecture itself became part of the struggle. A house built for display resisted adaptation, and the cost was paid by those inside. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical. Soldiers suffering from what was then called shell shock arrived confused, withdrawn, or volatile. There were no effective treatments. Quiet was prescribed. Rest was enforced. But Highclere was not quiet. The building creaked. Bells rang. Staff moved constantly. 4 men already fractured by artillery and trench warfare, the house offered shelter but not peace. Deaths occurred quietly. Some from complications. Some from wounds that never healed. Bodies were removed discreetly, often at night, to preserve morale. Records exist but stories do not. Names fade. What remains is absence. Rooms that absorbed grief without acknowledgement. Corridors that carried stretchers instead of trays. Behind the facade, the house learned new kinds of silence. The war altered the estate's rhythms permanently. Servant numbers dropped as men enlisted and women were reassigned to nursing or industrial work. Those who remained took on expanded roles. Kitchens operated continuously. Laundry ran day and night. Supplies were rationed. Coal shortages forced rooms to be closed. Maintenance was deferred. Roof leaks went unrepaired. Decorative elements were sacrificed for practicality. The cost of keeping it alive shifted from financial strain to physical exhaustion. Stand near the service areas during this period and listen. The house breathes differently. Boilers struggle. Water systems strain. Temporary partitions divide rooms awkwardly. Nothing fits perfectly. Highclere was never meant to function this way, yet it did because it had to. The building adapted, but not without consequence. Floors wore unevenly. Walls absorbed moisture. Structural stress accumulated quietly. When the war ended, the soldiers left, but the damage remained. Some scars were visible: altered interiors, worn surfaces, outdated systems pushed beyond capacity. Others were embedded deeper. The estate emerged into a post-war Britain that no longer supported its old assumptions. Labor was scarcer. Taxes increased. The social contract that sustained houses like Highclere had shifted. The bill came due all at once. World War II repeated the pattern with even greater intensity. Once again, Highclere was drawn into national service. The house was used for evacuees, military purposes, and administrative functions. The scale of destruction elsewhere made preservation here feel secondary. Repairs were postponed indefinitely. Staff shortages worsened. Materials were unavailable. The architecture aged faster under stress. Psychological residue lingered. People who lived and worked in the house spoke of a changed atmosphere, quieter, heavier. Not haunted in a theatrical sense, but burdened. The walls had witnessed too much. Rooms once designed to impress had been sites of pain. That memory altered how the space was experienced, even when not consciously recalled. Behind the facade of continuity, the estate struggled. War had exposed its fragility. A house that became a hospital revealed how ill-suited grandeur was to crisis. The very features that once symbolized permanence, size, complexity, separation, now complicated recovery. Modernization required funds that were no longer available in abundance. The cost of keeping it alive escalated while income declined. Stand in one of the former patient rooms and look upward. The ceiling is still high. The proportions still impressive. But the silence carries weight. This is where young men lay far from home, suspended between survival and loss. Architecture does not forget easily. It absorbs use, misuse, and memory into its fabric. What they don't show is how war stripped away illusion. Highclere's role during conflict exposed the true function of great houses. They endure by being repurposed, often at great human cost. The estate survived because it was useful, not because it was beautiful. And usefulness during war is never gentle. The legacy of those years is written into the buildings where, its deferred repairs, its altered layouts. Highclere emerged intact but changed. As the 20th century advanced, the confidence that once surrounded Highclere Castle began to erode quietly, then all at once. The forces that sustained great estates for centuries, cheap labor, agricultural dominance, inherited deference, collapsed under modern pressure. What remained was a house of immense scale facing a world that no longer needed it. The decline did not announce itself dramatically. It unfolded through balance sheets, bereavements, and rooms left unheated. Stand in the corridors during the years after the First World War. The silence feels different now. Staff numbers have thinned. Entire wings are closed to save fuel. Curtains are drawn to preserve warmth rather than privacy. The house is still standing, but it is shrinking inward, retreating from its own size. This is what decline looks like in architecture. Not collapse, but contraction. The financial strain was relentless. Agricultural income, once the backbone of the estate, declined sharply as global markets shifted and tenant farming became less profitable. Death duties introduced in the early 20th century struck particularly hard. Estates like Highclere were asset-rich but cash-poor, and taxes were calculated on land and buildings rather than liquid income. Each inheritance triggered a crisis. Portions of land were sold. Timber was harvested aggressively. Artworks and furnishings quietly left the house to cover immediate obligations. The bill came due repeatedly, and there was no surplus left to absorb it. Family loss compounded the pressure. The deaths of heirs, often at young ages, disrupted succession plans and emotional stability. Grief did not pause the demands of maintenance. Roofs still leaked. Boilers still failed. Stone still weathered. Stand in one of the unused rooms and look upward. Cracks spread slowly across the ceiling. Not dangerous yet, but persistent. Repairs are postponed. Postponement becomes policy. The emotional toll on those who remained was heavy. To inherit Highclere in this period was not a triumph but a burden. The house demanded constant attention and offered diminishing returns. Pride competed with practicality. Selling felt like failure. Preserving felt impossible. The estate became a daily negotiation between identity and survival. Power without a crown had become responsibility without reward. Step past the showpiece rooms that remained open for appearances. They are immaculate, carefully maintained to uphold dignity. But behind them entire sections are mothballed. Furniture is covered. Floors are left unswept. The machinery of luxury runs at partial capacity, consuming resources even when idle. Heating a single room in winter requires heating the infrastructure that serves it. Scale becomes an enemy. World War II deepened the decline. Once again, Highclere was pressed into service, and once again were accumulated faster than repair. By the war's end, Britain faced austerity. Labor shortages were acute. Skilled craftsmen were scarce and expensive. Materials were rationed. The cost of keeping it alive soared while income fell further. The estate existed in a holding pattern, neither restored nor surrendered. Behind the facade, decisions were made quietly and often painfully. Staff were let go, sometimes families who had served for generations. Gardens were reduced to manageable areas. Decorative ambitions were abandoned in favor of basic preservation. Even so, decay advanced. Damp crept into walls. Roof timbers weakened. The house aged visibly and invisibly at the same time. The social world that once revolved around houses like Highclere had moved on. Invitations no longer carried the same weight. Political influence shifted elsewhere. The estate's cultural relevance faded, replaced by nostalgia tinged with discomfort. To visitors, the house appeared timeless. To those responsible for it, time was the enemy. Stand in the library during these years and listen. You would hear calculation, not conversation. How long can this roof last? Which wing can remain closed another winter? What can be sold without breaking the story the house tells? This is the hidden labor of decline, constant assessment, quiet compromise, emotional exhaustion. Loss was not only financial, it was personal. The house absorbed grief without relief. Each death narrowed the circle of people who remembered Highclere at its height. Institutional memory faded. Systems once maintained through habit fell into disrepair. The architecture reflected that loss. Routes went unused. Rooms lost purpose. The house that became a machine now ran unevenly, parts grinding against absence. Yet surrender never came easily. The idea of letting Highclere fall into obscurity carried its own dread. Identity was bound to place. To lose the house was to lose continuity, history, and meaning. So preservation limped forward, fueled by stubbornness as much as strategy. The estate survived by narrowing its focus, by enduring rather than thriving. What they don't show is how close such houses come to vanishing without spectacle. No fire. No dramatic sale. Just decades of slow attrition. Decline measured in inches of damp, in rooms closed one by one, in conversations that circle the same impossible choices. Stand outside and look at the silhouette against the sky. It still commands awe. Towers still rise. Stone still holds. But behind the facade the cost has been immense. Highclere's 20th century was defined not by grandeur, but by endurance. Survival became the goal, not dominance. This is the quiet truth of aristocratic decline. Great houses do not fall quickly. They wear down the people who try to save them. They demand loyalty long after they stop providing power. A legacy with a price does not end when wealth fades, it intensifies. In the early 21st century, Highclere Castle found itself reborn once more, not through stone or inheritance, but through spectacle. Cameras arrived where creditors once waited. Lighting rigs replaced scaffolding. The house that had spent decades negotiating survival was suddenly recast as a symbol of elegance, stability, and old-world assurance. Millions around the world came to know it not as an estate that nearly failed, but as an icon of order and refinement. Fame did what generations of careful stewardship could not. It made the house desirable again. Stand at the gates today and watch the procession. Tour buses arrive on schedule. Tickets are scanned. Visitors step onto gravel paths already primed by expectation. They come seeking beauty, lineage, and escape. What they encounter is carefully framed. Restored rooms. Polished surfaces. Controlled narratives. This is not deception so much as selection. The house shows what it must to survive. The rest remains behind the facade. The transformation into a global cultural symbol was not inevitable. It was strategic. Opening the estate to filming and tourism was a calculated risk taken under financial pressure. Maintenance costs had become unsustainable. Roof repairs alone ran into hundreds of thousands of pounds. Heating, insurance, conservation, all constant drains. Fame offered revenue. Revenue offered time. The machinery of luxury, dormant and strained, was restarted under new management. Step past the showpiece rooms during a modern tour and consider what you are not being shown. The closed wings. The restricted corridors. The ongoing repairs that never quite end. Restoration is selective, focused on spaces that earn their keep. Others wait. They always wait. Preservation at this scale is triage. The house survives by prioritizing visibility. What modern admiration often misses is how much of this beauty is contingent. The illusion of permanence depends on continued relevance. Ticket sales. Licensing agreements. Media exposure. Without them, the familiar pressures return quickly. The bill comes due every season. Fame is not a solution. It is a delay. Behind the polished image lies a deeper irony. The global audience celebrates a vision of aristocratic life that never existed as shown. The calm, the order, the sense of benevolent hierarchy. What they don't show are the unseen hands that built, cleaned, repaired, and endured. The servants who vanished into corridors. The tenants who funded expansion through rent. The soldiers who filled rooms with pain instead of conversation. The families who inherited obligation instead of security. Stand in one of the restored halls and listen to the silence between voices. It is curated now, but it echoes with earlier absences. This space once absorbed centuries of labor and loss without recognition. Today it absorbs admiration. The transaction has changed, but the imbalance remains. Who really paid for this beauty is still a question rarely asked. The castle's modern image depends on contrast. Against a chaotic world, it offers stability. Against uncertainty, tradition. Against visible struggle, refinement. That appeal is powerful. It also obscures history. Exploitation becomes heritage. Sacrifice becomes atmosphere. Darkness becomes depth without consequence. Highclere Castle did not become famous because it was easy to maintain. It became famous because it was nearly impossible to keep alive any other way. The choice to embrace global visibility was born of necessity, not nostalgia. The house that once symbolized power without a crown now relies on public attention to exist at all. Step outside and look back at the silhouette. It is still commanding. Towers still rise. Stone still holds. But the meaning has shifted. This is no longer a private seat of authority. It is a public artifact, performing continuity for an audience that may never know the cost behind it. That performance pays the bills. It also smooths the past. There is dignity in survival but also discomfort. The modern glow of admiration can make it easy to forget that this house endured by extracting value from people long denied a voice. Tourism reframes that history as experience. Entertainment reframes it as story. Neither erases it. Behind the facade, the same questions persist. How long can this model last? What happens when interest fades? When repairs outpace revenue? When the audience moves on? Fame is powerful, but it is fickle. A house this large never truly rests. It only adapts. Highclere Castle stands today because it learned to turn visibility into oxygen. But visibility carries its own distortions. It invites admiration without accountability. It rewards surface without context. The danger is not that the past is forgotten entirely, but that it is remembered selectively, stripped of discomfort. Stand at the center of the house and imagine all its lives layered at once. Pagan ground, clerical stronghold, aristocratic engine, wartime hospital, near ruin, cultural icon. Each phase left marks, some visible, many not. The modern image asks you to admire the last layer most of all. This is the illusion of glory. Not false but incomplete. Beauty sustained by silence. Heritage maintained through compromise. Survival purchased with attention. Highclere Castle endures because it learned how to be seen again. What remains unseen is the price that made endurance necessary in the first place. A house that became a machine now runs on admiration. Whether that is enough long-term remains an open question. And perhaps that is the final tension worth holding. Behind every famous facade lies a deeper story, waiting not to be celebrated but understood. Which house should we investigate next?